Dr. Streff, it's great to have a subject matter expert join us. Thank you for coming to be here today. So as we talk about cybersecurity in masterIT's practice, it's probably the biggest conversation we've had with clients over the last 3 years. There's a lot of confusion around it. There's a lot of information in the press. So maybe you can help us today. Maybe we'll just start with, what are the biggest cybersecurity threats facing organizations today?
Yeah, and thanks for the invitation to be here. Did you know that 91% of cyber attacks start with phishing? 91% of cyber attacks start with phishing. So while some of us are working on the next big piece of technology to keep your green lights green and keep the bad guy out, or all kinds of things that we're working on at the endpoint level, the network level, the wireless level, you name it, the reality is that the real vulnerability is the person sitting between that computer and the chair. So the real question, the number one threat we have going right now is phishing and spear phishing. Doing social reconnaissance, trying to figure out who does wire transfers at a bank or who does payroll at a large company through social media, and figuring that out, and then launching a very specific attack to that person to get control of their device, and then to really impersonate a wire transaction or a payroll transaction. They'll lay in wait for quite a while, watching those payroll batches go. When are they paid? How big is the batch? How does this all work? And eventually they'll launch their own payroll cycle.
So when we say everything comes down to people, that's really true, right?
It is, and that's why I know your organization and ours are so focused on educating really businesses on the use of technology, and in our case, the risks of technology. So it's not that they shouldn't be using technology, it's just how do you become informed, and then how do you layer in people, process, and technology controls to keep your business safe.
Right. So, Dr. Streff, you were talking about spear phishing and phishing. A lot of times when masterIT gets called to deal with a new client, it's usually after a heart attack has happened.
Right.
And a lot of times we've seen in the last few years, those heart attacks are ransomware that have to be paid in Bitcoin. You were referring to people making bank transfers when somebody impersonates the CEO or the CFO of an organization. When we say the words social engineering, a lot of times people don't really understand what that means. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Right. So instead of just brute forcing and trying to push over the hardware or defeat a laptop or a personal computer or a mobile device, it's really defeating the person on the other end of the phone or the other end of the line, somehow tricking them to give information out. You might be going through their dumpsters or their trash. You might be calling some people and impersonating a trusted vendor, or physically visiting the hospital, or physically visiting the business and figuring out how it's laid out, where's the internet connection come in, and everything like that, so that you're social engineering the business and gaining information to either do the attack or to aid and abet the attack.
Right. Well, I can tell you from our perspective and our practice, just some practical examples of this. We've been called really from a ransomware scenario where people lost all of their data and didn't have it properly backed up, had to pay in Bitcoin, and still didn't know after they paid the ransom if they would not be held hostage again. That's one. Another, we know of several firms that have been spearphished into transferring money to a fraudulent account to the tune of tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And yes, insurance has covered some of that, but not nearly all of that. So from your perspective, where's the first place that organizations need to start to educate their employees about social engineering?
Yeah, I think it starts with risk management practices. What it starts with is making sure you've got every piece of technology inventoried, every asset inventoried, and you only got a limited number of funds. So is your risk in your email system? Is your risk in your web applications or your mobile applications? And I know the risk is everywhere, but the reality is you have limited funds. And so really getting through that risk management process, which is one of the things that we really try to focus on, so that you can then focus your limited resource. From there, that's where your training and education comes from. If you're concerned in a bank about skimming, right, then you're going to hang up some skimming posters, educate your employees about skimmers and how they work, what to look for, and build that into their visits to the ATMs. To be able to, part of the checklist is looking for skimmers. So,
Right.
It really starts with risk management. If your risk is phishing, or if your risk is clickjacking, or if your risk is physical, or if your risk is, it really depends on what locations represent the most risk, what assets represent the most risk, what people represent the most risk to you. Is it in a bank? Is it loan officers or tellers? If you had to educate one of those audiences, which at your bank, for example, would be where you would start. So really cybersecurity is really a risk management process.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the people part of the people process of technology. Let's talk a little bit about the technology. So we've talked about educating people. What do we need to do on the technology side, maybe to audit that, to make sure that the risk assessment is proper there?
For most SMBs, most small businesses, doing basic cybersecurity hygiene is really what you need. So we're talking about, do you have a firewall? Do you have antivirus? Are your systems patched? Are you running effective backups? We are really talking about the cybersecurity 101s.
Right.
And really, if every business had a firewall and every business always had good antivirus, right, always was patched and always was this, it would be very hard for the bad guys to get in. Right. But the reality is that the bad guys find a vulnerability in your system through a piece of software, Microsoft or whatever you're running, and then it takes a while for the manufacturer, Microsoft, to fix it, and more importantly, it takes a while for you to install it and all that. And that's the window that the bad guy uses, that short window, to get the foothold into your network.
Right. Well, I know in our practice, we tell people today that those tools are absolutely non-negotiable, but they're also not enough anymore. We're layering even more security products on top to make sure that if someone does get infected, that it limits it to the extent that we can to that person and doesn't crawl the rest of the network.
Right.
So we're trying to deploy as many tool sets as we can because the crooks are pretty smart, aren't they?
Right. They sure are. The other kind of technical things that you can really do is there are companies that can manage the perimeter of your network, monitor the perimeter of your network, monitor your network, and they, most small businesses don't have the resources to hire their own security person or to create all these network monitoring tools and then personnel to run them. So it's probably more affordable to get a slice of somebody at one of these monitoring companies that can sit and see an intrusion, notify folks, develop out the incident response procedures over time, train everybody in on all those kinds of things. There are certainly many sophisticated pieces of hardware out there. For example, firewalling is moving away from sort of the list-based approach of firewalling into artificial intelligence, where they're really learning all the normal behaviors, and anything that's not a normal behavior, right, that's what they're quarantining or taking action on versus, something coming from this area or somebody going here or something that has this in it, right? Those list-based things, they're really moving towards behavioral-based appliances. And certainly you can do all of those kinds of things, but those are typically the kinds of things then that if you hire somebody to manage the perimeter of your network, that they've got those kinds of tools in play versus what you would do on your own, which would be more of those list-based based tools. We at SPS Cyber, we don't do the operational element of this, right? We look for partners that really do the operational piece. We do the consulting, we do the auditing, we do the education, we can leave behind some products. But the operational stuff, I know your business does some of that. We're really not in the middle of the operational piece.
Right. We've seen in the last several years that the computer has escaped the box. Mm-hmm. So the network is not confined inside the perimeter any longer. We know it's not coming back.
Right.
So when we talk about the Internet of Things and that almost anything can be a device today, how do you address that, the IoT, from a cybersecurity perspective?
That's a good question. For our banking customers that we have, they're developing IoT strategies, right? And then with that is the security strategy for IoT. So in a larger regulated environment, they're developing, the same way they developed a mobile strategy, now they're developing an IoT strategy. For small and medium-sized businesses, and what is IoT? IoT is bringing any device to the internet. So there's about 10 billion connections to the internet right now, and it's suggested that by the end of 2020 there's going to be 50 billion connections. So it's my iDashboard, or it's my refrigerator, or all those kinds of things. We at the university, we have a lot of those devices. We've got IoT crockpots, right? And we were able to break into those IoT crockpots and overheat somebody's chicken. I mean, it's not a matter of national security, but when you hook that IoT crockpot up to your home or business network, right, and you're having a potluck at lunch and you hook it up so that you can turn it on warm and turn it on low or turn it on whatever, if it's hooked to your network now, and you can, if you can adjust the temperature of it or shut it off, now I can adjust the temperature and shut it off. And more importantly, it's an access point to your network, and now I can just pivot over to another device, right? Escalate privileges, pivot to another device, and pretty soon I own every component on your network through your crockpot. Right. So IoT really represents a lot of security exposure, but it also represents a ton of convenience for the consumer. And we always know that the consumer convenience will always win. Right. It's a freight train you can't stop because consumers want it. The millennials demand it. And an IoT crockpot is the same price as a regular crockpot with all these cool features. Right. But now you think of a home environment with blinds that you can shut or close from home, doors, locks, windows, crock pots, refrigerators, make more ice. It's the 4th of July coming up. All of those represent, now do they have firewalls on them? Do they have antivirus running on them? Do they have basic patching? All those things that we talked about that are the basic fundamental security hygiene, those appliances need to have it as well. Right.
Good point. So, I can remember a few years ago when we talked about business continuity and disaster recovery. In the SMB space, the conversations we would have is the leadership of those organizations would say, it's not going to happen to me. We're not going to have a fire. We're not going to have a tornado. We're not going to have an earthquake. We're not going to have any kind of disruption or disaster like happened across the city. Then it happens. And it's interesting. We did an event on cybersecurity with the FedEx Chief Information Security Officer last year. And she said it's a matter of when, not if, of a data breach and a compromise. And so I feel the same feeling today about cybersecurity risk as we felt about business continuity risk. And today all I have to do is ask any company who survived a business disruption or a disaster like losing their data, what that was like. What's the next big thing that you see happening in cybersecurity as a threat that would really get people's attention?
Yeah, let me answer that two ways. One of the next big things in our cybersecurity space is the forensic side of this. I can tell you we are growing our forensics division as fast as we can, and there's too much demand for forensic services out there. Data breaches are just a reality, and it's not just data breaches. Intellectual property theft, right, is a real concern, right? Business plans, strategic plans, engineering diagrams. These things, when we do risk assessments like for banks and they're like customer information's a high and all this other stuff, well, guess what? I mean, there's major breaches with foreign countries in particular that want all those engineering schematics, want all those strategic plans and all of that kind of stuff. And so protection is one thing, and then that response and forensics, who got in, how did they get in, attribution, what all happened, that's a huge growing part of the cybersecurity landscape. And when you used to talk about forensics, and most companies would roll their eyes and say, well, that's TV stuff or that's big company stuff. That's Main Street stuff now. Right, that's Main Street stuff. We all know that ransomware is the hot thing right now, right? Ransomware is malware. That's the ware part of it. Malware is any unintended software that you didn't intend to have on your system. That's what malware is. It's malicious software. And ransomware is malicious software that demands a ransom. It delivers a payload of not keystroke logging or not stealing the data, but of threatening. Here's some statistics for you. 38% of folks pay the ransom. 38% of you pay the ransom. So the business model behind ransomware is really compelling. And I'm going to talk about the business model of hackers. So they buy an email list for $1,000. It has 10,000 email addresses in it, right? It's a new scam, so most of your technology, your firewalls, and your filters won't catch this scam. So let's say that of the 10,000 list, 5,000 of those get through. And 38% then pay this.
It's a high return on investment.
It's a high return. Now, right now, the average pay is between $100 and $500. In the banking sector, it's a much more. It's about 2 Bitcoins, which is about $2,000. But even the average scam of $2,500 times 5,000 people and 38% of those, you do the math on that $1,000 investment. It's just spamming out people and not even really having the ability to crypto lock or to do anything, just extorting people using fear, and 38% of people say, well, maybe they'll go away, maybe this is real.
But so having the right backup policy in place to be able to restore is of paramount importance to be able to deal with that.
Having the right backups, having the right instant response capability. If this happens, what are we going to do? Are we going to unplug things? Are we going to pay it? You know, who's all going to get involved? Are we going to notify customers? I mean, all that stuff needs to be documented and practiced into an instant response plan as part of your disaster recovery capability.
So, Dr. Streff, let me ask you this. A lot of huge issues that are out there, a lot of confusion and uncertainty, but where does a good company culture start with addressing cybersecurity?
Well, I'm going to go back to education and awareness, right? And it really starts at the top. What we've seen so far in the U.S. and in Europe and other places is security has been kind of this basement grassroots thing. Well, that's the IT person's job, or that's the net admin's job, is cybersecurity. We're seeing a seismic shift into it becoming a boardroom issue. I'm working, for example, with some senators in D.C., Senator Thune from South Dakota and others, on the Cybersecurity Disclosure Act of 2017, and it's a bill that essentially requires boards to document why they don't have cybersecurity expertise at the board. On the board, a board position dedicated to cybersecurity. It doesn't require you to have to hire somebody there, but it requires you to justify why you don't. So if you're the Mayo Clinic, or you're a Centennial Bank, or you're a university that has customer and student information, health information, how are you going to justify that you don't need that?
Right.
And then if you have a breach or you have a problem, you've justified that you didn't need it. I mean, how is that a position, a defensible position in a court of law? So the largest thing that an organization can do is adopt that top-down model, get their board educated on what cybersecurity is. If you have an opportunity to put cybersecurity person or two on your board that have an IT background for the new digital economy, that would likely be a very wise investment. And pretty soon it looks like even if it doesn't get through this year, it's going to become more and more of a requirement that way.
Right. Well, one of the things that we do in our practice is just like with generally accepted accounting principles, is like anyone would have a financial audit or a review. We ask our clients, independent of us, to have a penetration test, cybersecurity testing. How can they address that initially and get started?
Yeah, those are services that we perform. I mean, in terms of sort of a basic cybersecurity toolkit, kind of what you're talking about, like for most SMBs and that kind of thing, a penetration test, which is simulating what a hacker does to try to break into your network, a social engineering test to really test your people to see what they know, right? Run some phishing tests, right? Go through the dumpsters and see who's not shredding confidential information. Maybe drop some USB sticks around different parts of your business. See what they're plugging into the network, and we'll label it payroll file and see what people want to see there. And if they're not plugging in enough, we'll say dirty pictures on the USB sticks. That's what a hacker would do, right? They would use any means possible. So those are the kinds of things that you'd want in your basic toolkit. You'd want some policies, like an acceptable use policy and a data security policy. These are basic policies that all businesses should have. If you're doing cyber insurance, they're looking for those kinds of things. Anyway, a bank typically has about 25 cyber policies. On mobile banking, internet banking, on all the different kinds of things. But most SMBs don't need 25 policies, but a couple policies, those technical tests, the penetration test, the vulnerability assessment, which is an internal look at your network for known vulnerabilities. So hackers look for known vulnerabilities and then exploit those known vulnerabilities. They share those known vulnerabilities. Once somebody finds a vulnerability, there's hacker chat rooms, there's conferences, there's conventions. They'll run a show on how to jackpot an ATM with this vulnerability, or how to compromise a small business with that's running these kinds of systems. Those kinds of things. So policies, basic technical scans from the inside and out. And then basic training that you can do for your board, your management team, and your employees.
Wow. Well, Dr. Streff, that's been terrific information. I think you've covered everything from people, process, and technology. Thank you, Dr. Streff. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.